Welcome, everyone. My name is David Safa. I am a staff member here at Save Our Sites, and I'm sort of the stage manager for the Zoom tonight. I will be conducting the Q&A later in the presentation, but for now, I'll hand it over to David Traub, who will tell you more.
Good evening. I'm David Traub. I'm the co-founder of Save Our Sites. Welcome to our 2024 winter lecture. The topic of our lecture by Dr. Stephen J. Peitzman is Towers of Medicine, Some History of Hospital Architecture in Philadelphia. Dr. Peitzman is a graduate of the Temple University School of Medicine. He practiced and taught nephrology and internal medicine at the Medical College of Pennsylvania and its hospital, and remains a partly retired professor of medicine at Drexel University College of Medicine. Interestingly to us is that he is widely known as an historian of medicine with 2 books and many articles to his credit. In recent years, Dr. Peitzman, Steve, has moved into this study of not just medicine specifically, but the architecture of medicine, hospitals in particular. Steve is a fervent preservationist. He's very active at the Philadelphia Historical Commission. He has written quite a few nominations to the commission for the designation of its historic buildings. We welcome Dr. Peitzman to our winter lecture. Stephen?
Thank you very much, David, and thanks for the invitation to do this. I begin with optimism that I will keep the group interested, but also with a certain amount of terror, because I see among those here some pros, some historians of architecture, very active preservationists. And if I make any large errors, I invite them to correct me later after the talk. But I welcome everybody. And it's one aspect of being a preservationist, an active preservationist, and attending various meetings over the last few years has been meeting David Traub. And we've become pretty good friends. And we also share an interest in theater. Some of you know that David is a published and produced playwright. And in fact, I had the opportunity to, in a very small way, help with one of his productions, I think his first in Philadelphia, since David also has a place in his hometown of Louisville, Kentucky. Anyway, what I'm going to do tonight is focus on several hospitals, several of which have some particular meaning or connection to me, as you'll hear about. So there's a very small autobiographical component to the presentation. And I chose the title because I'm going to conclude with 4 of the earliest, more or less skyscrapers, at least taller hospital buildings that arose at just about the same time, all 4 of which I'm talking about, and there were others about the same time, but the 4 that I'm talking about are all still standing, fortunately, and each has at least something of an interesting story attached to it. So let me get started by getting my slides up. All right, so here we go. I'm going to begin with an image that I use when I talk about hospital history, as I do with medical students. I teach several history of medicine short electives within our medical humanities program at Drexel. And so this is actually from Middlesex Hospital in London. By the way, a preservation loss a few years ago, a very old building. This is an image from a group called Scenes or Pictures of London, and it's from the 1820s or 1830s. And it gives you a picture of what until recently was the timeless image of more or less Western hospitals, at least the main part where the patients interact with the nurses and the doctors, the nurses more regularly than the doctors, of course. So it's an open ward. This is a women's ward. And I will usually ask the medical students to comment on what they see here. But one of the things that's pretty obvious are the very large windows, because ventilation has long and now even more so perhaps Ventilation has been one of the guiding objectives of hospital design. And over here, we probably see the one of the board members conferring with maybe the matron, sort of the head nurse, and others about the expenses and how things are going. In my training in internal medicine at Medical College of Pennsylvania, which is the former Women's Medical College, and the subject of one of my books, it's history, not MCP so much as Women's Med. One of our teaching affiliates was the Philadelphia Veterans Administration Hospital. So I spent about a third or half of my years there as a internal medicine and then nephrology trainee. And the VA hospital at that time had open wards with 16 beds. So I have experience in an open ward, and so I know something about what in some ways can be a positive aspect of it, although, of course, the worry about contagion is there. So the history of the development of the hospital building in the West in general, it's can be expressed in a relatively few words. One is ventilation and how to get it, and then spreading out as a hospital grows versus going high. And really, it came to the point where there really wasn't that much choice. Early on, you couldn't really go very high. The technology wasn't there. And then in cities, there wasn't room to spread out eventually. And fortunately, then there emerged steel framing and elevators on the way to go high. So that'll be kind of the obvious and therefore sort of unspoken theme as we move along tonight. But other things really are important as well, including the architecture and the setting, reputation of the institution, of course, finances. So naturally, a talk about hospitals in Philadelphia ought to begin with Pennsylvania Hospital, even though I'm really not focusing on it. Beautiful building, and it is notable for its beauty, its substantiality, and the fact that it's been well maintained on and off anyway over the years. And when I do my walking tour of medical history for med students, and we stop at the Pine Street side, we point out to them that this is more than was needed to take care of the sick poor. And by then I would have explained to them that until really the advent of safe surgery in the late 19th century and some other medical advances, pretty much the general hospital, the so-called charity hospital, really an import from England, was aimed at taking care of the working poor, the totally poor, and which is not to say that they warrant less than good, decent buildings, but that kind of objective didn't demand a really nice place. However, this was, in my mind, and I think that of others, a sign or a statement to the world that this growing city in North America called Philadelphia had become a pretty substantial place and was well capable of tossing up a very fine hospital building, something that the citizens even could be proud of and could contribute to help keep it going. It didn't look this way at first. In fact, Pennsylvania Hospital, like the vast majority of Philadelphia community hospitals, began in a house. Most Philadelphia hospitals, and I'm sure this is true of most other similar cities, began when there was some movement by some neighborhood individuals, some doctors, religious organizations, of course, to create a hospital, a refuge for sick persons who were ill. With industrialization and more persons coming into Philadelphia to work in the mills, maybe not so, and crowded living conditions, not so easy to get medical care at home as the well-to-do or even the moderately well-to-do could achieve. So it first in rented rooms, and then the ability to build one wing. And I think the story is then the other wing was built, and that would sort of somehow command the imperative that the central area would be built. And so we can look at the Pine Street extension, which of course is now several hundred years old, no longer used for patient care. Up at the top, I can't see it because my band of symbols is up there, and it's not in this photo, is the light up atop that illuminates the famous surgical amphitheater used for operations, especially educational demonstrations. Anyway, here's from, I guess, a Habs documentation, although fortunately it wasn't a farewell documentation, of, in this case, the third floor of Pennsylvania Hospital. And just to show a recurring theme of the architectural design, very, very logical one, central area for administration, for doctor's offices, for dining facilities, perhaps not necessarily for the patients. And then eventually some single rooms for the emerging paying patients. And then at the ends, wards for the typical patients of a hospital such as this, a big city charity hospital. And having these at the extremities so that the belief in miasms emerging from sick individuals, which is an extremely important part of the story of hospital architecture, so that given that that was true, as was a uniform belief, that there wouldn't be ease of movement of whatever the morbid substance was that could move. And just to expand on that a little bit, it was the firm belief that emanations from an ill individual could waft around and upward and infect. Now, the word infect and infection was used before it implied microbes or bacteria. So some sort of something, miasm we'll call it, could rise and infect other hospital individuals, particularly later in the 19th century, well, even before that, infect the wounds of patients with traumatic wounds or post-surgical wounds. And what they would acquire was an awful complication, a form of gangrene sometimes, that went by the name of hospitalism. It was so common and so feared that the word hospital became part of the name of this process. So even though the understanding was not correct, it was certainly a real phenomenon that drove early and until relatively recent times, the ideas of keeping patients, at least in groups, separate as much as possible. And then this drawing also shows the amphitheater on the next level up. And one of the extreme examples is this. I don't remember. It's from one of the, maybe from Pennsylvania Hospital for the Insane, the Kirkbride's place in West Philadelphia. So there arose two ideas to deal with hospitalism. One was a kind of a radical notion that hospitals should be temporary, disposable, and to keep whatever it was from moving from patient to patient, from ward to ward, set up numerous one level, because the concern was stuff drifting upward, one level barracks. And that was, of course, actually utilized in Civil War hospitals, which were already predetermined to be temporary. So this is one of the 24 or 25 Civil War hospitals in Philadelphia. This is Mauer, I think, the one that was in Chestnut Hill. And so in the center was the administration building and then radiating around. But the more practical notion was the pavilion hospital, sort of a compromise. This would be a durable building, but with more than one building, not going for one large structure, but still several structures with a particular and well-defined and well-regulated set of connections between them. And so we're moving to the first hospital I'm going to talk about, which is Episcopal Hospital, first known as the Hospital of the Protestant Episcopal Church in Philadelphia. And this is a gentleman, a physician named Casper Morris. He was a Philadelphia-born Quaker, although I presume he changed to Episcopalianism because he became very affiliated with the Episcopalian culture and community, I should say, in Philadelphia, and became interested in good deeds. He was an interesting fellow from the little I could find to read about him, a bit of an eccentric, but sort of an amiable eccentric. And an MD, practicing MD as well. At the time that he came into medicine in the mid-19th century, there was pretty much only Pennsylvania Hospital and the medical division of our almshouse, which was actually pretty substantial itself. And as happens with Quakers, I don't know if he was an acting Quaker then, so I'm speculating here. Quakers sometimes get in their mind a kind of a conviction. I forget the word that they use, that a personal sense that something beneficial to the community needs to be done. And he believed that Philadelphia needed a second hospital. And he wasn't quite directive about where that should be, but he began conversing with some friends, I believe, in the Episcopalian community. And to make a story that's a little unclear to me short, in terms of the outcome, a woman named Leamy, Leamy, a widow, relatively recent widow, who owned this estate in what is now Kensington up on by Lehigh Avenue, present-day Lehigh Avenue, gave the house and its dependencies to the Episcopal diocese with the idea that a hospital could be developed here. And so yet again, another Philadelphia hospital grows first in a house. And how could that be? Well, at least if it's a good size house, but even row houses became hospitals initially. You really needed some rooms, a kitchen, and maybe one large room would help. But this is before much surgery was done, before major surgery, entering the abdomen, entering the chest, was done virtually at all. And what was done was mostly superficial surgery, some of it fairly grave, but not most of it, and was done at home. And so was the rest of medical care. Again, if you had a home and you had some family support. So some hospitals got along pretty well with modified homes once they raised some funds to shape it up the way that would be more helpful. So this is the Leamy estate. And as the hospital grew, it demolished this house and began to build its own. And it built along the then well-established in England, and I think elsewhere in Europe, the pavilion plan. So this is the early phase. And we're looking from, this is Lehigh Avenue here. And this is now Civil War time, because this began to come together during the Civil War. Ground was broken for the first buildings, I think in 1861. And here we see what's going to be, already is, this central building. Seems awfully grand, but that's like maybe what administrators do at first, is make sure they have a good spacious place. And the first patient area, the pavilion hospitals were generally thought to go no higher than 3 stories. Well, you didn't go very much higher than 4 stories outside of homes in Philadelphia anyway. Philadelphia was into the late 19th century, be it hotels, factories, certainly apartment buildings where I live around the Queen Lane station, a 4-story city. But the pavilion plan was 2 or 3 stories. And the architect was Samuel Sloan, a very, very well-known architect, of course. And I don't know what to say about this building. It's got 2 thin towers, almost like minarets, a pointed major window in the front. And then over here is the West Pavilion. And although I can be very astray with this sort of thing, but I kind of get a little bit of a sense of Norman architecture over here. The square towers, this relatively small windows. Of course, this is all solid stonework. The towers, by the way, probably served a function. Reading a 19th century book on designing hospitals by the same Dr. Morris, who I just showed you, who became very interested in the field of hospital design as a physician. Very often, some kind of external room or alcove or tower was created basically for the water closets, so that the presumed foul emanations and the odor would not be in the main ward areas and could drift upwards. And I don't think at this point, but some vertical elements of tower-like structures that one sees, I presume these to be normal chimney up here, but passive ventilation systems were devised. When you look at photos of the Johns Hopkins Hospital from 1890, the most advanced American medical school and hospital, you see this forest of little towers, which represented a very complicated mechanical ventilation system. Again, ventilation was the key in the minds of the designers and the physicians and the patrons and everyone else. Ventilation was the key to survival in the hospital and doing well. And of course, it wasn't entirely wrong by any means. So second best, however, if you didn't really have the room to spread out would and achieve very good ventilation, would be at least having one side facing park area. Now, at the time, around Front and with Lehigh Avenue, there wasn't very much around. And so this new hospital wasn't very close to where most of the people were, but it would be in a couple of decades with the growth of industry. Now, this is the same two buildings from the other side, looking north. And first we see the chapel that Sloan designed, which is still there. It's the only surviving building from the Civil War period. And again, over here is one of the patient pavilions. And here's the connector. And what looks like porches or verandas are in fact exactly that. The connectors were as much as possible kept open so that someone going, staff or patient for whatever reason, going from one building to another would at least have some fresh air, some ventilation to maybe clear whatever this dangerous potential miasm was. And I'm sure they could be used as well for patients just to get some air and recuperating. And this, I like this. This is an 1876 print. Maybe it's a wood engraving, I'm not sure. Again, now shows the Kensington Hospital complex with two mirror matching pavilions, the chapel and the central building. And now we have a string of 5 buildings. So this became very much in its day an excellent example of this way to build a hospital. Now, pay mind or think about the front wall of the central building here, because something was going wrong with it, and that turns up in the story later. The floor plan is pretty much an expansion of what I showed you for Pennsylvania Hospital. Central functions in the center, ward out here, ward out here. This is actually the chapel. Some single rooms and for various functions. Of course, there's increasing number of patients. Medicine is getting a little bit more complex in the 19th century. So rooms for various things. Eventually you need a room for the interns to do some beginning lab work and various kinds of treatment rooms. And this just shows what one of the wards looked like. There's a wonderful Habs Historic American Building Survey collection of photographs from the 1860s, 1870s of Kensington Hospital. And some of them are photographs of early photographs done by somebody at the hospital. But this is the men's ward. And again, you can see kind of inset, maybe for some theory about getting air, but not keeping it in. I don't know, or maybe it was just the thickness of the walls, but windows all along the sides. We're going to skip that.
You keep saying Kensington Hospital, but I think you mean Episcopal Hospital.
I have Kensington in mind. I mean Episcopal Hospital, of course, as I said earlier. Thank you very much. This is an aerial view from the 1920s. And here, let's see, keep on losing my cursor, but below is the campus of Episcopal Hospital. And it's grown and grown, and things are spread out all over the place. And across the way, by the way, here's Lehigh Avenue. This is the immense Bromley Carpet Mill, a big competitor of those of us here in East Falls who would be allied with the Dobson Mills and Dobson Carpets. And so no longer the fresh air around the area. But of course, this is quite a bit later, 1920s. It still is a landmark. Find the chapel here. Now, this is on the grounds right on Lehigh Avenue. I imagine that over the decades and over the many changes, Episcopal Hospital still functions for certain services under Temple. It's no longer at all a general hospital. Maybe this was just preserved, maybe a little guardhouse or something, kind of a Gothic Victorian stone structure. So I spent a lot of time on Episcopal because of it being a marker of the pavilion type hospital and really Philadelphia's second substantial hospital after Pennsylvania. But also part of my education was here. When I was a medical student at Temple, Episcopal Hospital was a busy general surgery and medical hospital. And it was my favorite of the Temple affiliated hospitals, including in the Tower building, that we'll get to a little bit later if I keep talking. Now we are going to go to Kensington Hospital, and we're going to first look as an introduction at the house that was acquired when a young recent Penn medical graduate named Howard A. Kelly wanted to create a women's surgery hospital in Kensington. And so it is, for the architecture folks in the room, it's clearly, and it's from the 1870s, I don't know the exact date, an Italianate villa with light or lantern on top. And this is an addition from the 1890s, but this was the whole place at first. And this is that young man, Howard Kelly, and he was from a Center City, fairly affluent Irish-American family, Penn medical graduate, and he did something approaching something like an internship at Episcopal Hospital. And he kind of bonded to Kensington, which by his time, the 1880s, maybe the late 1870s, 1880s, was, of course, an enormously busy area of manufacture, especially textiles, but all kinds of other things as well. And he set up practice there, and he was particularly interested in surgery. And here's where I need to tell you that the 1880s and 1890s represented the real opening up of surgery. It represented the opening up of bodies, really, because with anesthesia coming on the scene in the 1850s, 1860s, and the germ theory, the recognition of the microbial cause of various diseases in the 1860s, 1870s, and particularly ascending in the 1880s, with those two advances, it was, and some others, it was, but particularly those two new ways of doing things, it became relatively safe to enter the human abdomen, the pelvis, on a regular basis. And a lot of that early surgery was gynecologic. And Kelly had perceived in his early years at Kensington and in his early days in practice, an awful lot of women were experiencing a great deal of chronic pelvic pain. And this was a period of surgical exuberance, and so probably more surgery was done than we might think absolutely necessary. But Kelly thought, indeed, there's almost no question that he really believed there were a lot of women who needed help. And so he rented rooms in a house, I don't remember what street in Kensington, and found somebody to serve as nurse and assistant, and then was able, with his, I guess, the help of his family, and he also was allied with the Episcopal community, to buy the house that I showed you and set up something approaching a hospital. So kind of a continuity from Episcopal Hospital to, which came into life as a general hospital for the poor, to something kind of relatively new on the scene, a specialty hospital, in this case for gynecologic surgery. So there it is as seen now. And I want to point out that this was the original cornice level, and it was a 3-story house. As the place got more and more crowded, and there was a need for more and more space, in 1910, I think it was, an extra level was added. But before that, there were 2 other important additions. Oh, sorry, we're going backwards. Oh, so this is the first segment, again, the house. Oh, this is the nurse's residence. And this is the operating room. So we're not spending too much time, as we should, inside. That's really what's important. That's what architects have to design. And so whatever, maybe some partitions were taken down, but a large room was identified. And this was the surgical operating room for Dr. Kelly and his assistants. And notice the simple wooden tables as would be used at home for surgery. Later on, with the advent of the germ theory and a kind of a mania about keeping germs under control, you didn't want wood in the operating room or in the hospital for that matter. Too many little crevices, too porous to clean properly. But we do at least have over here sinks for the understanding that hand washing is needed. And then in 1896, the hospital, after a bit of fundraising, was able to hire Thomas Lonsdale, pretty well-known Philadelphia architect. I will say that Philadelphia hospitals and medical schools in general went for some of the big-name architects. Lonsdale wasn't perhaps in the upper tier category, but he was a very well-known, productive architect. And so he designed an addition stuck onto the back of the original house here. And whatever that is, for a long time, I wondered, because I would visit Kensington Hospital, and I loved, right across from it, by the way, I have to digress a moment. And one reason, perhaps, why the house was chosen among possible others was that it is on Diamond Street facing Norris Square. So it did have that advantage of at least one exposure of park-like, indeed, good fresh air, even if north facing. And Norris Square, of course, is still there. It's a lovely place. And this part of Kensington is becoming rapidly gentrified. Fortunately, this cluster of buildings is on the Philadelphia Register. And I'm proud to say, thanks to a nomination that I did some years ago. And again, why I'm so fascinated by it. Anyway, back to this extension. This was a ward on this level. There's 2 levels below that you can't see, because the hospital, in its long history and its fascinating story not to go into here, underwent many kinds of transformations, from a gynecology hospital to a general hospital, a nonprofit, and a Spanish-speaking hospital, and so forth. But at some point, I'm not sure when, probably 60s or 70s, it built an outpatient clinic on the corner here. Anyway, what I thought, what is this little gable for here? And it wasn't me, but maybe it was Nancy Pontone who suggested, or somebody did. It's supporting a skylight. And here are the remnants, not because this space is presumably no longer in use, of 2 very large windows. So I lost a slide. Sorry. I was going to be showing you a slide of the operating room in the new extended building, which had tables with nice white enameled legs and everything looking very different, and lots of light from the skylights and the large windows. Most hospitals of any size, even of not much size, started a nursing school because the student nurses, in fact, did most of the nursing in the 19th and into the 20th century. And that was not enough time to talk about it, although it does kind of interest me. The nursing school here was designed by Watson and Huckle, as was the building, another building behind it, and the elevation to 4 stories of the house. And so that in the nursing building, which sometimes was also the school, there was an aim, not so much externally, although sometimes, to make it look different, so it didn't seem to be the hospital. Now, these buildings look very compatible because stylistically they are, and to create inside a warm, comforting place, because these student nurses really worked very hard. Here's a charming, no doubt true snapshot of several student nurses at Kensington Hospital in that building I just showed you. I presume it is, because you know the photos from Kensington Hospital, well-attired and scholarly nurses. All right, we're going to move on to, let's see what time it is, to the last segment. We're leaving Kensington behind and its hospital buildings that we displayed, all 4 stories or less. And we're going to talk a little bit about towers, even if not the tallest towers in the world. So I'm thinking about this. This is a building that is literally called a tower building of Episcopal Hospital. We're back to Episcopal Hospital. And I literally spent a lot of hours as a junior medical student and then a senior medical student in the Tower building, even though this was in the 60s. And by then, I guess a 3 or 4 level hospital building, a spread out type modern building at the time, had just opened. So the Tower building was still in a kind of a semi-segregated way for the wards, for the poorer patients, the Medicaid patients. If we had Medicaid then, I don't remember. And I remember it pretty well. I used to, for years and years and years, I had dreams about doing rounds in Episcopal Hospital, partly because it is of Gothic style, not necessarily inside, but it did have, or does have, a central stairwell that must have had good fire doors. Otherwise, it would have been a fire hazard that would have had to have been closed off, I guess. And way up at the top, where there were some men's 3 and 4 bed, or maybe there were 4 and 6 bedrooms, I don't remember exactly. It was tended to be kind of dark and even a little bit Gothic and spooky. But it was where the medical students had, frankly, the most opportunity to participate actively in the care of the patients, although we did with the private patients over in the Potter building, I think it was called. But I'm thinking about a patient approaching this building when it was one of the main surgical medical buildings, and looking up at it, like even a building this size, I think it's 10 stories. Most of the ornament is up top. You really, like in so many skyscrapers, especially when they're packed together, you can't really see anything of the artwork at the top. Looking up there and saying, what's in store for me in this big place, as it may have seemed in 1929 or so when it opened. And here's the entranceway, which is the other area where you see some of the Gothic detail. This building was designed, by the way, by Horace Trumbauer firm in his later years. Let's see. It opened in actually, I was a bit wrong. It opened in 1932. And also, Day and Zimmerman are, in some sources, are associated with it as well. Trumbauer and Day and Zimmerman. D&Z, I think, maybe by then being thought of as mainly engineers and builders, although I know they certainly did architecture at various points in their career. And so you're entering this grand entrance, relatively grand entrance for Kensington. And here's this arch pointing upward. What is it pointing to? Is it pointing to heaven? Is it pointing to relief? Is it pointing just to what's going on at the top of this building that you can't even see? Well, I said we're talking about 4 high-rise, moderately high-rise hospital buildings, all built within a few years of each other in the late 1920s, 1929, 1928, actually, 1932. And as many of you will know, there was a ton of building going on in Philadelphia in those years, and all kinds of buildings, many of which are still there, obviously. Reservationists would like more of them to be there, but some of the really highly embellished office buildings that were late 19th into the early 20th century are long gone. But in the late 1920s, also the monumental buildings and everything else, it must have been a really busy place in the downtown. And in fact, it was noted by the Enquirer, which recorded record period for hospital building, new projects for Jefferson and U of P, which is correct, although I'm not talking about them, Children's Homeopathic and Kirkbride's, which had been the acquired name of Pennsylvania Hospital's mental health division in West Philadelphia, also osteopathic, and 3 new operations. That doesn't mean surgical operations, it means building operations already started. Okay, so here are the 4, and on the upper left, these are the slides that I rushed to put together at the end of the day today, so they have various flaws. At the upper left is the Hospital of the Hahnemann Medical College from 1928, closed not that long ago, We lament its closing, and it was placed on the Philadelphia Register in a nomination done jointly by Oscar Beisert and myself. Oscar, of course, did the architectural descriptions and some other parts, and I did the Hahnemann history. And then St. Luke's and Children's Homeopathic Hospital on upper right, which still stands. Sorry, no, I got the labels even wrong. That's St. Luke's and Children's is below here. This is the women's, first called the Women's Building of Pennsylvania Hospital, opened in 1929. And it's now the Spruce Building at 8th and Spruce Street. And let's see, get this band out of the way. And here in the lower right, so these are switched. This is the building of St. Luke's and Children's Homeopathic Hospital, photo by David Traub, thank you. And again, over here is the tower building of Episcopal Hospital. So let's talk about them individually and what are their stories and why did they all come to be built within a few years of each other? Well, maybe some coincidence of need, but again, it was a time of maximum building. And if I can find it, yes, I will read something to you from the annual report of Episcopal Hospital talking about the new building. And the Board of Managers was brought face to face with a critical situation and a most important decision when competent engineers reported the front wall of the administrative building that we saw before in a row of pavilions was in serious condition. Reinforcements were needed. There were big cracks developing. It was looking more and more unsafe. And so the Episcopal Hospital leaders, and it was still with the Episcopal Church at this time, Episcopal Diocese, they needed to do something. Your board was then presented with the problem, either of rebuilding the weak sections of the administration building, leaving it practically as it was, that is, it wouldn't be any better than it had been, or of tearing down the old and replacing it with a new and modern building, going higher and providing space for the much needed maternity department. So Episcopal wanted to expand or create a maternity department, and also for the better care of the children's department. After considerable discussion and investigation, it was the unanimous opinion of the board that a new building should be constructed. Owing to the low building costs of the day, it was considered that to make additional expenditures for a new building that would tremendously increase the efficiency of the hospital, rather than spend a large sum in repair work, that would be wise. And steps were taken to immediately secure architects and to proceed with the work. So I was curious about the low building costs of the day. I don't know what accounted for that, but that probably played a role as well. So, but back to the story of St. Luke's and Children's. St. Luke's and Children's were both homeopathic hospitals that had recently merged. And I just need to give you the quickest lesson about homeopathy. Homeopathy was an alternative medical system, mainly a therapeutic system that grew out of the beliefs of Dr. Samuel Hahnemann, a very scholarly German physician, and went around the world and is still very popular, especially in South America as an administered healthcare system, and in India, maybe not as much as even 20 years ago, and became very, very popular in the United States, including Philadelphia. We were a center of homeopathy. The beliefs of homeopathy were that a substance that could become a medicine, a substance that would cause a certain set of experiences or sensations in a healthy person would cure those very sensations or symptoms, we may call them, in an ill person. And by eradicating the symptoms, thought Dr. Hahnemann, you had eradicated the disease. He didn't believe much in deep, hidden tumors, inflammations, and other such things. There's more to it, including the law of the maximum dose. That is, the more dilute a medication was, the stronger it would be. So these were beliefs that were promptly in the 19th century and continuously scoffed at by regularly trained physicians. The homeopathic community grew and eventually had its own hospitals, journals, medical schools, and so forth. And we had quite a few in Philadelphia. But there was a sense of competition between the homeopathic profession and the so-called regular profession. And we'll talk about that when I get to Hahnemann in just a couple of minutes. Anyway, this was 1929. Let's see. St. Luke's Children's Hospital was completed in 1929 again. By then, we had some real advances in surgery and medicine, and a lot of doubt about homeopathy as a real viable system. And there was a split within the homeopathic profession between those who wanted to compromise, kind of use the best of both systems, and those who wanted to stay with the high dilutions and continue, in the eyes of many, to look ridiculous. So, in fact, homeopathy as a profession, and it had grown to a kind of a parallel medical world, was in retreat. Now, that probably wasn't necessary for two hospitals in Philadelphia to get into financial trouble in 1929 because we were over-hospitalized at that time. And that's a whole nother story. We clearly had too many hospital beds. St. Luke's Homeopathic and Children's Homeopathic found at least some reprieve from their woes by uniting and somehow raised the funds to unite and build a new building. And they hired another very well thought of architect, Amos Barnes, and a very busy contractor, William Steele and Sons. And I'm going to, for what it's worth, consider this maybe it clearly has classical elements. There's a set of projecting bays with, you can't see them in this photograph, with some classical details set on top of a classical portico, although one might also consider this kind of a Georgian or colonial revival. I'm probably wrong about that, but there's definitely classical stuff in there. And one other interesting thing about St. Luke's Hospital before it merged was it came under it was very close to closing, and it was rescued by some women supporters of homeopathy, which was actually quite prevalent. And it too began in a rented house. Now, finally, the Hospital of Hahnemann Medical College, built 1928, 1929, I think it opened early on. Some really interesting things about it. And I think it represents, and this is the biggest. It was, counting some of the expansions on top, 18 or 20 stories, a really sizable place, and up to date. All these 4 high-rise hospital buildings, when publicized, proclaimed how up to date they were. One aspect of which was to have radio reception in every room, which was probably pretty cool in the day. I would have liked that. Anyway, what's kind of interesting here, and I did a lot of research, even though Mr. Beisert did the descriptions, I kind of went a little deep into the architects. This had been attributed to Horace Trumbauer, which makes a lot of sense. But in the vast amount of fundraising publicity that we have in the archives of Hahnemann Medical College, now with Drexel College of Medicine, which is the continuation of Women's Medical College, MCP, and Hahnemann. I always have to explain that with verbal footnotes. We have a lot of Hahnemann material about raising money for this building. They published a kind of a fundraising newspaper once a month and everything else. Horace Trumbauer is never mentioned. Who is mentioned a great deal is a gentleman named H. Hall Marshall. Not easy to find information about him, except in some advertisements he placed in the census, in some other sources. He's listed as an engineer. Although in some of the Hahnemann publications, when they refer to him, and he is referred to quite regularly by the board of the Committee on Building, by these publicity articles. Mr. Marshall was on site and so on, met with the faculty. He's the individual most referred to, and he's often referred to as architect. But there was also an architecture firm working in Alliance named Pettit and Ferris out of New York City. And I haven't looked lately, but when I was looking pretty fervently, I found almost nothing about these folks. There's a book called 1,000 Buildings of New York City, and it didn't seem like Pettit and Ferris built any one of them. And exactly, now Marshall lived some years in Philadelphia and some years in New York, so he probably knew Pettit and R. Ferris. There's always the possibility of a homeopathic connection, believe it or not, because there was a tremendous lay support and kind of, I wouldn't criticize it by calling it a cult, but there's this real layer of individuals, middle-class educated persons who really believed in homeopathy. So there was a kind of a networking of homeopathic believers I have no evidence for that whatsoever. And I have no idea. I really couldn't find very much about how they came together. I know it was correct because there's one entry in the minutes of Mr. Ferris being on site, meeting with, I guess, some board members to choose the color of the brick. It isn't sort of what I would call a stylized Gothic revival, and of course it's still extant, and we wonder very much what's going to happen to it. In the publicity material, it points to, and I'll be done in a couple of minutes. As Nancy tells me, I always prepare too much material. It talks about special high-speed elevators, special glass to filter out harmful rays, radios in every room, elevators, an entire floor of operating rooms. Again, because we're still in the era where many hospitals really turned their work almost entirely over to surgery. Now, there was a variety of surgery done in 1928, 29, but a decade earlier, it was mostly gynecologic and the appendix. It was great for surgeons in the late 19th century when the appendix was kind of discovered as something that got in trouble. And then, of course, there were tonsils. So, and surgery really is not very compatible with core homeopathic belief. But again, homeopathy played no role in this hospital. It's not mentioned except in some of the publications, the Greater Hahnemann News, which is really this publication about the fundraising, about the building to come, because Hahnemann's building were pretty old and dusty by this time. There's an occasional nostalgic article about homeopathy because you don't want to really offend the homeopathic alums. And actually, there's going to conclude with Pennsylvania Hospital's women's building. And there's a story there as well. And it's not entirely a happy story. Early on, Pennsylvania Hospital did take women in for delivery. But of course, in 1700s, most women, middle-class women, working women, delivered at home with a midwife, maybe occasionally a physician. And that there is no clear reason for that to change right away. So, however, there arose in any big city like Philadelphia, charity hospitals or institutions, if you don't want to call them hospitals, for maternity care of unwed women, individuals. And major hospitals didn't really want the stigma of dealing with those folks. So here in Philadelphia, we had the Lying In Charity, we had the maternity hospital, and they were always, like many of the other hospitals, really struggling for finances. But early on, Pennsylvania Hospital did have some maternity service. But I don't remember the year, but somewhere in the early 19th century, they had an outbreak of childbed fever, puerperal fever, a horrible thing. And this was before the germ theory, before it was really understood. And they closed, as had to be done, they closed the maternity service. And they didn't reopen it for a long, long time until the 1920s. There arose it's a whole new world of maternity care. And there arose the belief within the leaders of Pennsylvania Hospital to revive obstetrical and maternity care. And it's since become one of the favored places for having babies in the city. And so that was an opportunity to build something big that could also house some other functions. The architects chosen were Zanziger, Bari, and Mederi. And the construction was supposedly managed in-house. I don't mean that the nurses and orderlies came out with spades and brick toters, but they didn't hire a major outside contractor, and that there was a feeling that they had the expertise to pull in the various needs. Anyway, that's neither here nor there. But I thought I would show you, since all these tall buildings, of course, depend upon the steel skeleton and the elevator. Just show you one of these buildings in Genesis here. And here's what it looks like. It's still there today. It has this very interesting set of almost filigree-like appliances on the side here. I believe these facing west, this is Spruce Street along here. I believe that these were verandas for patients and post-delivery patients or post-operative patients. I think there was a children's section as well in here to be able to get out and get some fresh air and light. I don't think these were just fire escapes. I should know but I don't for sure because I haven't been able to find it. I'm sure the question can be answered by the Pennsylvania Hospital Archives. What's also interesting to me is there's no historicist application that I see in this building. It's not Gothic revival like Episcopal, at least, and Hahnemann. And I didn't show you very much of Hahnemann in that regard. And it's not classical. It's probably what modern architects of 1929 would most applaud. Maybe it has some horizontal belt courses for a little bit of eye interest and contrasting with its own moderate verticality, but it isn't something that is modern with steel framing embedded in some historically determined ornament. So I was going to say something more about why Gothic might have been chosen. And here's the answer. It, of course, was a popular style by 1929 for the other buildings, that is, popular style for skyscrapers. And there's a lot, I read a lot about some of the theories and ideas about why the Gothic, if you're going to have a historical style, why Gothic makes sense for skyscrapers. Obviously, both are vertical. If you think about the cathedrals, both are cathedrals and skyscrapers. They're both, by definition, they're almost high. And there are a lot of other thoughts that have everything to do with capitalism, to whether cathedrals can be also thought of as an internal framework with an external skin. So if I ever do this again, I'll get my slides in better order. And sorry for being late. I will stop share. And
I think that Stephen deserves a word of thanks for that wonderful performance in his lecture. We've heard lectures on churches, religious buildings, mansions, public buildings, even cemeteries, but I don't recall ever hearing a lecture about hospitals. And this certainly was the definitive lecture on the subject. And thank you, Stephen. And I also want to mention that Stephen at the Historic Commission did write the nomination for the designation of the Kensington Hospital building, which was successful. Stephen, what is the square that's on in North Philadelphia?
it's on Norris Square.
Yeah. You can still go up there and see that building. So thank you for that contribution to preservation. Anyway, now I'll turn it over to David Soffa, who will monitor the Q&A. David?
I'm happy to stick around and try to answer questions. Now, this was not a definitive presentation on the architecture of hospitals. There's a definitive book by somebody called Kasaki, and there's lots of deeper stuff written.
Great. Well, yeah, I'd like to, if anyone does have a question, they can feel free to either unmute themselves and just ask, or you can write it in the chat. I see, I think this may be a question actually for David Traub that Daniel is asking, that was great. When are you starting walking tours again?
Whose question is that?
Daniel Verbit,
yeah.
Verbit, sorry
for
about
both
that.
of you, because that's really awesome.
I'm going to make some announcements about Save Our Sites at the end of the Q&A, but to briefly answer your question, that we're going to have a walking tour in June when the weather is better. The location of the tour is yet to be determined. Yeah.
And what about Stephen for doing like a hospital walking tour?
Stephen?
I'm actually, on behalf of East Falls Historical Society, Nancy Ponton and I are leading a historical architectural walking tour of the Oak Road here in East Falls. And you'll have to look at the East Falls Historical Society.org website to learn more about that.
Great.
Can you hear me? Hello, can you hear me?
We can hear you.
I just wanted to say the Gothic Hospital, circa 1932, with the spires on the roof, it absolutely blew me away when I first took note of it. And I knew it was going to be circa 1932. I believe the architect might have recently seen a King Kong movie and offered the rooftop spires for added security for large threats like gorillas. But I'm just jesting, but I'm just saying that the Gothic revival, and here you're taking in the Empire State, the Chrysler Building. It was an incredible time to be an architect, and I'm just thinking about the Philadelphia architects who came in and proposed that spired building, with the spires at the of that building, the Gothic building, and how they would explain it to Philadelphia about putting in those spires and that incredible architecture, bold new architecture, and how that went down. I would have liked to have been there at that first meeting. Anyway, it's just to say that I love that the Gothic era, and I was just surprised when it was brought to my attention that it was right here in Philadelphia.
Oh, it wasn't not limited to Philadelphia by any means.
Steve, this is Paul Steinke, and I just want to commend you on a wonderful presentation. I wanted to know if you, I'm sure you're familiar with the former osteopathic hospital building at 48th and Spruce in West Philadelphia, and if you could speak for a moment about the difference between osteopathic medicine and homeopathic medicine.
Yes, I know of that building. I don't know what its current status at all.
It's now occupied by a Korean Presbyterian church.
Oh, well, that's interesting. Here in East Falls, we have a former fraternal building known colloquially as Palestine Hall that's similarly occupied by what I think is a Korean Presbyterian church and putting it to good use. Anyway, yeah, osteopathy versus DO versus MD, very, very little real difference in the training. In fact, I should have said that was true of homeopathy, at least at Hahnemann Medical College, in that from the beginning almost, its leaders, and it goes back to 1848, founded just about the same time as the Women's Medical College of 1850, but its early leaders wanted to teach the basic sciences as they were, along with homeopathic therapeutic theory. And Hahnemann always continued and always did that. But anyway, osteopathy, of course, believes in a form of physical manipulation therapy. And many graduates of osteopathic colleges, which have increased in number over years, compared to MD, go into family medicine, where some, I believe, it's fair to say, do not continue practicing osteopathic manipulative physical therapy. I'm not sure what the appropriate term is, but others do and think it's an important and useful addition to their ways of treating patients. In terms of their education, learning anatomy, physiology, genetics, and everything else, I'm sure identical. In my residency years and into my faculty years, I'm mostly retired. I'm still with Drexel College of Medicine. I still do a little bit of practice at a free clinic at night with med students and some other teaching. I mentioned some history of medicine. Most of my retirement time is now devoted to going to my own doctors and historic preservation work. But where was I? Oh, but in my residency years at MCP, I worked with many osteopathic graduates, and I still have osteopathic graduates as colleagues at Drexel College of Medicine. So I can't give much more of a fuller explanation, except to say that if a patient seeing an osteopathic general physician has diabetes, they're likely to get the same treatment. If they have back pain, they might get some additional insight and an additional form of physical treatment.
Okay, well, thank you very much.
I saw that Eleanor had her hand up. Eleanor, do you have a question still?
Just two comments that I heard, I guess, a couple decades ago when I took a tour of Pennsylvania Hospital that I could share with your audience. On the top of the central building facing Pine Street, where the surgery was done, it was only done on sunny days at high noon because the light from the sky, from the sun, made it possible. This was, of course, in the days before electricity, and that solarium up there was open or windowed or whatever to let the sun come in. And the other thing I learned on those tours was that when you walk along that the original Pine Street building, in the lower level, below the first floor level, there is where the mentally disturbed patients were kept. And it was where, for example, Stephen Gerrard, who I think wanted to get rid of his wife, placed her when there was trouble in their marriage, and she was housed below grade. And you can walk along there and see that depression and see where they kept those unfortunate human beings.
Wow, thanks for those details. Max, Max, you're muted, so go ahead and unmute yourself on the lower left hand side of your screen. Little mute button.
Okay, here we go. Can
There
you
we
hear me
go.
now?
Yeah.
Thank you. I'm sorry, I'm having a little bit of a hard time here, unfortunately. But anyway, I just wanted to mention, first of all, thank you for the talk. It's extremely interesting. Nice to see a lot of people I know, incidentally, also.
Yeah.
But what's interesting, we used to, the 20s, I never really put it together, but how much, especially with the advent of the Depression coming along, we had a massive amount of building. The Art Museum between 1927 and 29. If you walk down Walnut Street, you'll notice on some of those buildings, you'll see 1929. I've noted that for a number of times, and I was wondering how it was done. Just at the pivotal point of the Depression. However, there's a little explanation. But I just want to relate two things. Open wards. I had my tonsils removed. You mentioned tonsils at Graduate Hospital, open ward. But also during the Vietnam era, or actually later, the Naval Hospital, which was a massive hospital and had that gradation. I wouldn't say necessarily Gothic, but that Art Deco look, but very tall. Had a very impressive look, open ward, and that was interesting also. But also it reminded me too of Philadelphia General Hospital, with massive hospital that is not even in our consciousness today. But that's it. I just wanted to make a few comments in that respect and to say hello and thank everybody.
So we have a few comments in the chat. Susan Babbitt says, excellent presentation. Thank you. Kathy Dowdell, my apologies if I'm mispronouncing some names, but she says, Steve, this was a great talk. Thanks. By the way, I had both of my kids at Pennsylvania Hospital. That was a while ago, but as I understand it, it's a great place to have a baby. Love that. And then we have a comment from Building Planning saying, this is Greg Pritchard. Interesting to see the similarity between the tower of the Women's Building at Pennsylvania Hospital and Bryn Mawr Hospital, both designed by Zantiger, Boris, and Madari. Very interesting. And then Christopher Jostin says, thanks so much, Dr. Peitzman. Great presentation. Okay, and do we have any other questions or comments?
Yeah, I actually have a question. First of all, thank you very much for this fascinating history on hospital architecture. And I'm just wondering, what were some of the key aspects of hospital design from 150 years ago that are still key aspects today? I know that our knowledge of germs and bacteria and microorganisms has greatly increased now, but what are some things that they really got right? I know you talked a lot about ventilation, so maybe some methods of ventilation or layouts that worked really well that are still proven to be the most effective methods today.
Well, that's a challenging question. It's in the one book by Dr. Mars I looked at, talking about the small details, not the construction of running a hospital. A lot of it was about cleanliness, which maybe doesn't necessarily equate with asepsis, but is something that maybe influences the outlook and spirits of patients, that things look crisp and well looked after in the hospital. And they knew about that and probably worked as student nurses and others mercilessly in some of the better run hospitals. What occurs to me is not an answer at all to your question, but to think about how things sometimes can go in the wrong direction. There's been a great emphasis, especially since COVID, on hand washing in the hospital and how careless physicians have been about washing their hands between patients and their stethoscope heads, and whether we should be wearing neckties, traditional neckties that can dangle. Anyway, what am I getting at? Again, I certainly have reached the age where I tend to sometimes drift back. So I was thinking again about the Veterans Administration Hospital, where I spent a lot of time as an intern, resident, and so on, and actually even attending physician for some years. And I came to really like the place and the veterans. So I really value my time there, although in some ways it was a frustrating place to work. However, the building that I worked in there was designed in the 1950s. And the plan included having sinks to wash hands in the corridors, not between every 2 rooms, but frequently. And then for some reason that disappeared from hospitals. And I don't know if it's the expense of drainage and plumbing or just looked unsightly or too many sinks to clean. And I don't know if this has been studied, but it occurred to me that probably became a disincentive to hand washing, which is kind of like what you're getting at, maybe a basic thing that hasn't lost its value. If there had been more hand washing, there would not have been childbed fever, most likely, or at least not as much.
Not as widespread as it was.
So,
This is David here, David Traub. Let me just interject a moment. That provocative question was asked by Miss Shelby Rowe, who is here. Now, Shelby is one of our staff members. She's the head of communications for Save Our Sites. She designs all the flyers and posters and graphic material. She's also in charge of the mailings. She's the woman who gets the word out that brought you here tonight. So I want
All the emails that you get are from
everything, communications. So thank you very much, Shelby. Without your assistance, no one would be here tonight.
Thank you all for opening your
another question. I think Max had a question or a comment.
Yeah. Could you hear me? Can you hear me? Okay, very good. I just wanted to mention too, not a question actually, but I just wanted to mention that Hahnemann Hospital in the 70s was noted for their cardiac department. And so I had family members that had things done there, and that was the center at one point. That was one of the premier hospitals, the Hahnemann, for the heart surgeries and other things like that. But also, I wanted to interject also that both of my kids were born at Pennsylvania Hospital, so that was pretty cool. That's it. Thank you.
Great. Well, does anybody have any last questions or comments? If not, I just want to give a quick plug for the Save Our Sites YouTube channel. So this and all of our past talks are on YouTube. If you just search Save Our Sites Philadelphia, our channel will come up, and this talk will be there as well. So look for that in the coming weeks.
Yeah. Well, David, let me make a few concluding remarks. Yes, this Zoom was recorded and it will be available on YouTube. Shelby will send you out an announcement when that will be available. It might be as late as this summer, but you will hear about the recording of this event. Just to conclude, of course, I want to thank Dr. Peitzman, Steve, again for an incredible lecture. I just want to make an announcement for a forthcoming Save Our Sites Zoom, which will be on April 17th. That's a Wednesday. It will be a book talk by Miss Amy Jane Cohn. Her new book, Black History in the Philadelphia Landscape, Deep Roots and Continuing a Legacy, has just been published. It's in the bookstores now. And Amy is going to give a book talk on Zoom April 17th. That will be our annual spring lecture. Then lastly, as I said in June, we will have a walking tour It won't be a walking tour of the Philadelphia hospital. That'd be very difficult to walk. We need a bus because they're spread out across the city, of course. But what the walking tour will be in a constricted district where we can easily walk and see what's to be seen. And then we'll have a party afterward, as we always do at some nearby restaurant. So that's coming up probably the first week in June. So that's the future of Save Our Sites. Again, we thank you for coming tonight, and we hope you enjoyed it, which I believe you did. I get the sense that you did. And we'll see you all hopefully April 17th. Good night.